series, I wanted to talk about some aspects of the food and beverage culture here in Vietnam, and specifically thinking about the connections to other cultures and to history and to place. And I think a great way to get going on that is by chatting about coffee and coffee culture here in Vietnam, because it is quite unique and it is quite central and it's very pervasive and it's awesome. I came to Vietnam for the first time about a decade ago. I did fall in love with the local coffee here. It's quite different, and it's really unique and powerful, and it's really bold, and it's its own kind of thing. So when I went back home, I came with one of those little contraptions called a fin, Phin, and it's just this little kind of tin or stainless steel contraption that sits on top of your cup and produces a kind of slow drip into usually condensed milk, and that's cafe sua, cafe with milk. And sometimes I'll even make that at home. I have some Vietnamese coffee in my fridge back home, and I have cans of condensed milk in my pantry, and sometimes I'll just enjoy making that because it's just really flavorful and robust and delicious. What I have discovered on my time in my time here in the last month plus is a couple things about coffee in Vietnam. First of all, it is an absolutely central part of daily life in this country. Coffee culture, cafes, cafe culture. And it's not just one thing. Yes, that sort of basic coffee, the cafe sua, or just the cafe itself without the sua, without the milk, is still the baseline. But there's so much more that's on offer here, and it's really blown my mind, right? So first of all, I think it's fair to say if you got on Google Maps and you were looking up coffees, or even if you were just looking at the area that you happen to find yourself in, coffee shops, cafes might be the single most populated business in this country in terms of just per capita numbers, just sheer volume of these places. And I've just been kind of blown away over and over again by the sheer number, the sheer volume, the sheer pervasiveness of cafes in this country. You can literally never find yourself in a place that doesn't have a coffee shop within a half block, right? I remember walking around Da Nang and in the cool little island where the beach is, and I was getting tired, I was getting hot, and so I sat down and got myself a soda, probably a lime soda. It's one of my favorite refreshing drinks to get. And I just looked at I was at this intersection. It's kind of a major intersection. It was my cafe, and then on that side was another one, and over there, like all four corners of this major intersection had a cafe. And sure enough, if you walk down any one of those streets, there's going to be 4 or 5 more of them. And so just blows my mind how many there are, and still how many people you'll find at any given cafe, any given coffee shop, because it's just a deep part of everyday life, right? So in America, coffee is like drive through, get your coffee, chug it down, get that jolt of caffeine. What does David Chang call it? Low grade cocaine, right? It's like get your business day going. So for us, coffee is like an on the move kind of thing. Here, it's much more of a sit down and let life happen kind of thing. So there's not a lot of, I haven't seen any drive-throughs, frankly. And there isn't a lot of like to go, right? If you're going for a coffee, you're going to go sit down. And one thing I noticed as I was walking around in Saigon, it was pretty early on, one of the first weeks I was there, just walking through the streets and again, seeing coffee shop. And what I noticed at some point is that all of the because everything's little squat little stools and these tiny little seats, tiny little tables, everything's kind of low to the ground, simple, cheap, efficient, effective. It's the way they do it. But I noticed that everything was pointed facing toward the street, facing out of the shop. It's not like we're going into the shop to kind of sit down and be together. Most of the coffee shops that I discovered are open. They're open air, right? They don't even have like a front door, right? You just walk in. And there's a lot of fans. And AC with closed doors is a little more rare. That's more of a kind of high-end coffee shop. But most of them, just sort of by proportion, I think, are these open-air concepts with stools and chairs pointing outward toward the street. And it's really interesting. You're walking down the street, and both sides of the street, there's people just sitting, watching you, pointing out, sitting there watching kind of the street, watching traffic, watching just life happen. It's pretty wild. It's like, life is a play, and coffee shops provide you this kind of front row seat to what's going on. So there's a huge emphasis on just sitting and observing life and just watching things happen. And I remember thinking, like, this is really interesting and unique how all of the chairs and stools are pointed toward the street. Where have I seen that before? That feels familiar. And it kind of dawned on me that last time I was in Paris, I noticed the same thing. In Paris, in France, a lot of the cafes, same kind of thing. It's like they have the chairs pointed, literally everything pointed toward the street. The whole point is to sit down with your cigarettes, your coffee, your tea, maybe a little pastry, and just take some time and watch life happen. And so it got me thinking about those kind of cultural influences that I've been interested in, and specifically the French colonial influence. And so sure enough, the French were here from the late 19th century, late 1850s until basically the Second World War, like 1945, 47. And certainly here in Hanoi, you see much French influence. The architecture, you'll find a lot of really impressive bakeries, French, patisserie type places, cake shops, and some of the French pastries here in Hanoi are really quite exquisite. Versus down south in Saigon, I noticed that there's bakeries, but the pastries are a lot softer down there, whereas French baking, French pastries are quite flaky and delicate. You see that more in Hanoi. So the French influence here is more stark, I think. And sure enough, that Indochina period was, Hanoi was the center of it all, right? And so lots of influence, lots of cultural influence to note. And in another video, I might talk about, the baguette and the banh mi and some other dishes. But the coffee part of it is quite interesting, right? And so sure enough, doing a bit of research, and coffee does come from that French presence. But in the cultural studies literature on food and food studies, there's this concept of translocalism. This notion that, food might come from somewhere else. It might be even imposed or kind of forced onto a culture. But then there's this interesting localized process of adaptation, of kind of taking something from somewhere else and making it your own. So if you go to a Pizza Hut is pretty popular here in Asia. But it's very, very different than the Pizza Hut you would notice back home, right? Seafood pizzas, put honey on pizzas, and lots of really interesting ways that different, food practices and products from back home, back west, get adopted, but then changed, right? Changed and made local. And you see a lot of that in terms of the coffee culture here. So the major distinction, I would say, is that, in the West, I think virtually all of the coffee that we consume in terms of our espressos and drip coffee and all the rest of it comes from Arabica beans. And so that's kind of the Western coffee. And Arabica beans are known to be more subtle, a lot of nuance. You hear people talk about notes of wine or, berries or, right? And so Arabica beans produce coffee that is quite subtle, nuanced, and it's what we're mostly familiar with, which is why we tend to think of Vietnamese coffee as being quite powerful and a little off-putting. Vietnamese coffee is made from Robusta beans, right? And so those are the two main coffee beans that coffee is made from globally. And turns out that Vietnam is actually the #1 producer and exporter of Robusta beans anywhere, right? And so they really adopted coffee culture here in Vietnam, and it's apparently easier to grow, or it's better conditions for growing the Robusta bean here versus the Arabica bean, which you find more in like Brazil and Africa, right? And so we don't get a lot of the Robusta beans back home in the US, at least not as commonly, but you can. And sure enough, I was on Amazon and I was looking up some of the best producers that are over here to see if you can buy them back home. Sure enough, you can. So that's exciting. Now, that's one of the main kind of distinctions in terms of like coffee was sort of given to the Vietnamese, but the Vietnamese kind of made it their own and produced their own plants, their own, style, right? And from there, things just really become more interesting. So you're probably familiar with the Fin drip coffee and the Cafe Sua and the kind of the condensed milk and in the cup with some ice, and that's standard, right? But there's some really other interesting products that you will find here and that have kind of blown my mind. So when I was in the central part of Vietnam in Da Nang and Hoi An, I discovered a few coffee drinks that I wasn't really familiar with before I came out here. The creamy salt coffee, which is the drip plus it's actually a heavy dairy-based cream incorporated in with some salt on top, and it's just absolutely exquisite. My wife fell in love with that one because it's got this really incredible salty kind of quality, plus the creamy dairy, plus that intense, robust coffee flavor on the bottom, and it's just exquisite. The problem is it's never enough, right? They give you these kind of little cups. So that was a great one to discover. Also, maybe more my favorite was the frozen coconut coffee, right? And the way that one works is you often will get like a little 2 cups kind of thing. You get the tiny little pourer of just the coffee itself, and then you get a cup filled with, if it's the iced version, the frappe version, this exquisitely delicious, sweet, refreshing coconut kind of frappe. And there's some additional flavorings there that I need to figure out. But then you kind of add the coffee into it and you mix it all up. There's no dairy in that one. It's all just coconut based. That one I absolutely fell in love with. And it makes perfect sense when you think about the heat, when you think about the coast, when you think about just how refreshing a coffee-based beverage can be. We're kind of familiar with ice-based or frappe-based coffees back home, but those are more usually, I think, kind of desserty. These ones feel more appropriate to the conditions and the place in terms of refreshing, delicious, and very much about the coffee itself, right? And then, of course, you get up here into Hanoi, and I don't know if anyone out there has heard of the famous egg coffee, but that's one that I just but I found the place that invented the egg coffee yesterday. It was a big moment for me, Cafe Gia. And going back to times of dairy scarcity, what do? You want a kind of creamy, foamy, coffee-based beverage. So the proprietor of this cafe came up with this idea of blending a little bit of condensed milk with egg yolk and frothing that up. And it creates this incredible kind of rich, silky, think about a latte without dairy, right? And so it's sort of a replica of a latte. But if you have no cow dairy, this is what's available, right? And so the egg coffee was kind of born in Hanoi, and there are places in the States right now that serve egg coffees. You can get them if you find a really nice Vietnamese restaurant. You can often find the egg coffee or even the egg cocoa. I had both yesterday. I had the egg coffee and the egg cocoa, and all they do with the cocoa is they just put some cocoa powder in the end and kind of mix it all up. So it's so fascinating to see how coffee was bequeathed to this nation and this culture, but then some of the interesting iterations and expressions of what's available, what's not available, and what can come out of that. And so I have enjoyed, I've got the creamy salt, the coconut, the egg coffee, and the Cafe Sua, yeah. And so those are just some of the most common regional variations of coffee that you find here. I need to stress just how wonderful Robusta-based coffee is and can be, especially if you like espresso, right? Go ahead and take that step into the world of Robusta coffee, because we are talking dark chocolate, we are talking rich, intense caramel flavors, some vanilla, a little bit of tobacco perhaps, right? But the best Robusta coffee in my mind, excels beyond Arabica-based beverages back home. I'm going to have a hard time going back to espresso after this trip because I've just fallen in love with them. And they're so cheap, and they're so available, and they're so pervasive. And so I have greatly enjoyed my sort of time in between my meals because, a huge part of my focus is to be exploring dishes and restaurants and so on. But cafes are every bit as important here in Vietnam. They are very generous with their Wi-Fi passwords. They're usually printed on receipts or on the menus themselves. They are totally happy with you taking the Wi-Fi password. They're also totally happy with you sitting down forever, right? You get no grief about moving on. Back home, it's like, hey, come on, time is money. Get moving, get new customers in. If you're going to be here, you need to be buying. You could literally sit in a coffee shop for hours, and I have on a couple of occasions. I've done some work just by sitting in a coffee shop and just whiling the time away, and no one even looks at you. Sometimes they'll bring you a free tea when you sit down, an iced-based tea or a hot tea, and they're happy to have you, and there's no pressure to buy more. Sometimes I will feel guilty, and I'll get a second or even a third coffee just to kind of feel like I'm paying my rent. But coffee culture is one of the most important parts of daily life here for everyone, it seems. And especially, in addition to the coffees and the teas, the fresh juices that you can get here, the sodas, the smoothies, it's all fresh. It's all exquisitely delicious. It's extremely affordable. And so I have, feel like I've been in a coffee party for a month and a half here. So I just wanted to share some of the distinctions and some of the influences, some of the carryovers from the French sort of presence and colonial presence here, but also the way that over decades and over the course of time and space, you get to see these really interesting iterations take shape and how things continue to evolve. So I definitely encourage, if you haven't had a Vietnamese coffee, go find it. Maybe get yourself a Phin, go buy yourself some Robusta beans, get yourself some condensed milk, and explore and have fun because, wow, it is really eye-opening and palate expanding.